Hello and welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Author Series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages and backgrounds. You can find more information at our website, wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. Feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function or the chat. Books are available through our bookstore, &Books. I'll put the links in the chat. Writers and Books would like to call attention to the complex and troubled history of the lands on which we live and work. We are convening this event from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as the Seneca people, or the Keeper of the Western Door. We're so happy to have Gayatri Sethi with us this evening. First, we'll hear her read, then she'll be in conversation with Sejal Shah. Sejal Shah is a queer BIPOC femme of mixed Gujarati, East African, and Indian parents. She is the author of the debut essay collection, This Is One Way to Dance, Essays on Race, Place, and Belonging, named both an NPR Best Book of 2020 and a finalist for the CLNP Firecracker Award in Creative Nonfiction. The recipient of a 2018 New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Fiction, Sejal is also the author of the forthcoming short story collection, How to Make Your Mother Cry. She writes like she's trying to dance, a portal to another place. In her luminous debut, Unbelonging, Gayatri Sethi deftly interweaves verse, memoir, and a bold call to action as she recounts her experience searching for home in the diaspora. Drawing on her life story as a Tanzanian-born-Punjabi turned American educator and mother of biracial children, Sethi tells the intimate tale of stepping into her power while confronting misogyny, racism, and empire. Gayatri Sethi is an educator, writer, and independent consultant. She teaches and writes about social justice, global studies, and comparative education. Born in Tanzania and raised in Botswana, she is of Punjabi descent, multilingual, and polycultural. She is also the co-founder of the Desi KidLit community, an initiative to build solidarity among South Asian diaspora writers for young people. Gayatri, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Sejal, for this opportunity to be in community and to share with you. What a warm welcome, and I'm so delighted to finally, after all of these weeks of planning, to be sharing space with you. I'm speaking to you from the sacred lands of the Muskogee Creek people near Atlanta, Georgia. And I wanted to read a few things to you to give you a sense of the vibe, if you will, of Unbelonging. It's a genre bender of sorts. It's part memoir, part feminist workbook, part call to action, part verses. So there are many things interwoven on these pages. And I want to remember that in the sacred traditions of my ancestors, that very often a gathering like this might begin with a mantra. And the mantra that comes to mind, I'm also named after a mantra, but the mantra that I had at the conclusion of my book reminded me very much of Sejal's book. And so I want to begin with that. Mantra for remembering. Remember, your life is a slippery dance. You may trip and fall. There are systemic traps and personal triggers that leave you feeling less than. Try not to make space within for feeling less than. So I want to begin there. And then I want to acknowledge that part of the reason that I wrote this book over the course of the last 5 years was because, you know, on the daily, we wake up wherever we reside to devastating news, devastating examples of systemic violence that are bleeding in the streets and grocery stores. And this week in particular was a very challenging one for our Black kin in particular, with reminders that their lives are ever under duress, and that sometimes there are just no words. And so throughout the book, there's also sections where I make journal entries. And one of the journal entries that I made was on the day that the Capitol was stormed, so to speak. And the words that were being used to describe that were also inadequate to the violence that was occurring. And so January 2021, I wrote, "When I name my grief and anger, it frees me up to create room to breathe. And somehow I carve out coping strategies for survival. By some magic, I do create joy." So thank you, all of you who made space in your day and in this week in particular, in this space and time, to be here. It is meaningful. It means so much that we are here despite everything that is going on. And may we find something that we co-create in this space together that will be meaningful and will hopefully offer us something that we wish for. All right, so Roxane Gay asked, in a similar time period, she wrote an essay, a very powerful, potent essay. And she asked, how do we write trauma? And then she proceeded to write an essay. So before I read the essay, I took the invitation. There are many questions in Unbelonging. And that was one of the questions that I held on to. And of course, I wrote pages and pages. But ultimately, on page 247, for those of you who might have a copy, I then answered it very briefly. And I said, before I read her thoughtful essay, I jot down, how do we write trauma? Slowly, mindfully, tenderly, compassionately. For me, writing potentially traumatic experiences of unbelonging requires keeping things general and vague. I refuse to regurgitate every slap in the face or instance of discrimination. Some psychologists say that retelling trauma creates more trauma. And often we repeat the cycles instead of interrupting them. I write my trauma vaguely, slowly, cautiously. And this is my trauma writing response. Throughout my life, I've been asked a lot of questions that have accumulated in my psyche, so much so that I had to actually write a whole book answering some of these questions or asking more questions in response to those questions. And so one of the things that I then go on to talk about is a trauma response. There's a piece in which I say, when we're confronted with challenging information, do we react or respond? And I ask us that question. And so my trauma response has been that, you know, hiding identities can be a trauma response to othering and oppression. And when some of your identities conflict with each other, then you adapt and hide them to get by. But when this becomes a way of life, a forgetting of sorts, you lose vital parts of yourselves. And how do you recoup your lost selves? Or do you go adrift? And that was part of the emotional urge that prompted me to spend time creating Unbelonging, was really to recuperate, to remember, as the mantra was, to put together some responses to the traumas of unbelonging that have been throughout my life. One of the first questions I was asked when I first came to the United States, and I was 18 years old at the time, one of the first questions I was confronted with when I first came to these, to here to pursue higher education was, what are you? What are you? And I thought to myself, This is the first time I've been asked this. I come from the sacred lands of the Tswana people, and we greet each other as Dumela, Dumela, Dumela. Utsohirajang. There's a sing-song way that we greet each other. We don't greet each other with, what are you? And so I was like, huh, how do I answer this? A human? And so this question is a consistent one. I still get asked this one. And so on page 140, I list off some of the questions that come to mind that go with, what are you? Well, what are you? And how come you're African, but you say you're not African American? Would you consider running for public office? What is a critical language? What's an F1? Why don't you celebrate Christmas? So does that mean you're actually Muslim? And when you sometimes cover your head, what does that mean? And you're not American and you can't vote, so why can't you contact your senators anyway? I mean, I get asked questions like this all the time. And each one deserves its own volume. And I can't answer some of them. So as I said, sometimes the trauma response, these are loaded questions. So then I go on to say that an inquiry is not an inquisition. And so as someone who's been an educator for much of the time that I have, for the last 30 years, pretty much, I really value inquiry, but also I'm the subject of inquisition very often. So then how do I dance that dance? And so I tried to come up with some verses throughout these pages for that. And so I started to invent language, actually, and I started to talk about how to answer some of these questions. And here's a verse I offer. To be an Americanish immigrant is to live and breathe daily with weighty questions and reminders that belonging is unbelonging in belonging. And to be here is to reside on the land whose keepers are the Muskogee Creek. But as an immigrant, I was almost 40 years old when I first heard this land acknowledgement. To be here is to be educated and to hold multiple degrees from elite institutions that pride themselves on their global acclaim. And to be here is to know that I hold considerable educational privilege while being minoritized and presumed inadequate, despite my verifiable advanced global competence. And to be here is also to be keenly aware that brown people end up in cages and on the other side of walls. To be Desi-ish, Africanish, Americanish is to revere your own mythic goddesses while you offer deep bows to the humans who are rarely respected by Desis. To be Americanish, Desi-ish is to call out our not so secret biases and prejudices. When the Desis in America wish silent complicity, I speak out. To be Desi-ish and Americanish is to refuse to make excuses for your kin who uphold anti-Black oppressions when we ought to dismantle the systems that oppress us all. In my Americanish existence, I am often questioned and asked why I affiliate consistently with Black folks. It is implied that this is a form of reverse racism. To be me is to understand the unspoken, that immigrants often adapt to white adjacent forms of success. And I choose to align myself with my lived truths. I decided to be an immigrant who says out loud, Black lives matter. The reason I call the book Unbelonging was because there are so many parts of myself that are in conflict with one another. And whether I grew up on the African continent, or whether I visited extended relatives on the subcontinent of South Asia, or whether I reside here in the sacred lands of various peoples, this is an ongoing dilemma. And so I ask myself in this volume, what am I trying to fit into? Why is belonging often forced or required? And so part of the reason of titling the book Unbelonging was to reflect on identity and belonging and the contradictions, and to interrogate the very notion of belonging. And I'll pause there, and I'm sure I'll read other pieces, but let me pause there to invite Sejal to join me in conversational reading.
Thank you, Gayatri. It was wonderful to hear you read some of this beautiful book. I had this idea of call and response, but I wonder if you could talk about the form a little bit, because it's so, well, it's doing so many different things. I wonder where it's shelved. I've been thinking about this with, where do you want to see your book? Well, I'm happy to see it next to my book, but it's nonfiction, it's poetry, it's a workbook.
Yes, and and initially it could have been a disaster.
Right.
You can think about the drafts being so, and when I began to release some of the notions in my head about what a book ought to look like, and what fiction is supposed to read like, and what's nonfiction supposed to read like, and what is a poetry collection, when I started to do what many people say they do, which is to decolonize, but I really take that deep into my heart and soul, as the verses in this book indicate. And so one of the ways that I practiced this decolonial instinct when it came to writing this was to lean on spoken word practices of South Asia, was to lean on the conversational norms of the Botswana people, who are really incredible orators.
Right.
Speaking is a way of life where I grew up, and every person in every meeting would stand up and offer a speech impromptu. I mean, really, if you've ever been to Southern Africa, you'll just be blown away, because every person is an orator. And you don't have to be a politician or a teacher or some kind of, everyone takes language so seriously. And so I kind of leaned into some of those spaces and gave myself permission to write freely and creatively on the pages. And this is what came out. It came out in multiple languages, which I did not italicize. Came out as ways in which there was spaciousness on the pages, because there were interruptions on the pages. There were all of those things are how I actually live. So this is the thing, is that if I'm a person who defies an easy categorization, then neither my book nor the way I write is going to be slippery and at times messy. And I wanted to actually just make that normative, to say, I mean, really, the form ought to match the message and the person writing it. And the person writing it can't write an essay. As much as she admires the essay writing creativity and craft of you, Sejal, I couldn't do it. I tried to sit down to carve out.
I just really appreciate, sometimes with those essays, thank you, but I feel like I wrote them individually mostly, right? I was hoping to work toward a collection, but when I was putting them together in a book, I wasn't sure. It felt almost like shoehorning myself into some conventions of the book that didn't quite sit with me, but I wasn't sure how else to do it. So it was very exciting to look at your book and see, here's a quote. I mean, just to see what it looks like, right? Just like visually, right? That there is a lot of space, that there's.
See, even the research prompts and the research. Right. That was the educator in me, and some of my pedagogy made it onto these pages.
Yes, I love that. And
Yes, the type
dictionary, right? I mean, I just love the way that it looks.
That was very intentional. When I was doing the final manuscript, I wrote notes in the margins for time. And then I worked with Annika Surin, who is a delightfully talented South Asian artist. And she and I worked in tandem in real time. Like we would spend time together. And she's like, what does that note mean? And then we would talk about it. And then we would come up with the whole structure. And then even the citation structure. Citation was really important to me. But in something experimental like this, and something that aimed to be a creative nonfiction, for lack of a better way of categorizing it,
Right.
I really wanted to make sure that we had a consistent citation structure. So I had to create that.
Right.
Without doing footnotes. Thank you, bell hooks. Yeah, like so. Yes, there was a lot of experimentation.
What was that like for you to experiment that way, having come up in academia with, its disciplinary divisions?
It was scary and it was frightening. And the inner critic voice was telling me all the things that my, academic professors and colleagues always did. And so, the thing that I really wanted to do was to write against that in some ways, and to write despite that in some ways, and write past it in some ways. And I'm still trapped. There's one doesn't fully escape all of those things. When you've been, I spent 10 years doing my doctoral work. You do get institutionalized.
Yes, you do, right? What was your doctoral work in? Was it sociology or education?
Comparative education at Stanford.
Wow.
But undergraduate work was a lot of anthropology and ethnographic work. And so so to answer your question, it was very difficult and challenging and scary and frightening. But as I did it more and more, I just wanted to hold myself to one thing, which was to not just want to be creative, but really what I wanted to do was to write in both form as well as in words that felt true.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted them to feel true. And the thing is, there are many purposes for which we write. I didn't want to write a book that was informative. I actually wanted to write a book that would disrupt and make you feel things. And so if that was what I was trying to do, if I was trying to make you feel things, if I wanted it to be emotive, if I wanted you to see laid bare before you in form and structure, as well as in words and content, what the inner lives of an unbelonging feel like, right? Not think like.
Yeah.
Then I needed to really step out and try to write in a way that I hadn't seen. And so there was no mentor text.
Right. I mean, it's so helpful to hear you say that, right? I mean, it's helpful to me.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, in publishing, they talk about comparison texts, right? Comp texts. But sometimes there isn't one if you're creating your own genre, right?
There wasn't one. And trust me, I read widely and searched high and low.
Yes.
There were elements of bell hooks' style that informed mine inevitably, and Toni Morrison's, and then the poetry of Audre Lorde. And I think closest was when speeches were given by Audre Lorde, in which she interwove essay form with giving a formal speech, with poetry, with stringing words together that was almost like speaking in tongues that Chandra Mohanty talks about. Mm-hmm. That's what felt the closest to where I was trying to go, but I didn't necessarily see models, not in academic writing or conventionally published writing. And so I think, we don't necessarily have to talk about this, but one of the challenges with the work that was aside from writing was once I wrote it, then began this, okay, well, who's going to publish it? And that's where the creative freedoms and licenses that I took really caught up with me. I didn't think I was doing something so drastic, because I couldn't answer questions like your comparison text and your mentor text and, give us the comps. I couldn't answer those questions. And I
actually haven't heard mentor text before.
That's used in young adult literature and in literature. It's very important for children's literature writers in their MSFA programs. This is the normative kind of way that they talk. Mm-hmm.
What's the text that you're working in the tradition of?
Exactly.
That's really interesting. I mean, I didn't, that was not a question I saw in the author questionnaire.
Yeah.
But I spent a lot of time after I wrote my book thinking about that, or even as I was putting it together. I mean, you mentioned Audre Lorde and bell hooks, right? Got my bell hooks here. And the various writers that you quoted from, and I wonder if we could talk a little bit about Black and Brown collaborations and also the anti-racist work you're doing. Also, I mean, I was so, God, I was moved by all of these. I mean, I'll just read a few things from your book if I can.
Please, that would be an honor.
August 5th, 2019, Toni Morrison passes away. I noticed that people of all races co-opt the grief of my Black kin as they whitewash her legacy. I'd like to offer my deepest condolences to all my Black friends and family mourning the passing of Toni Morrison. She is your Ms. Morrison. She is your ancestor now. I remind us non-Black folks not to center ourselves or appropriate emotions that are not ours to claim. She was bluntly clear in everything she wrote and taught. She said she wrote for and to Black folks. I'm grateful that I learned I was on sacred ground reading Beloved, or The Bluest Eye, as a brown immigrant child arriving in America with very little understanding of the racist history and dynamics I entered. I read her books. I learned. She wasn't writing for me, yet I benefited from her words. Even in her passing, she taught me not to claim or appropriate Black grief. I am learning that Black grief is sacred. As I grieved the passing of an intellectual giant and an extraordinary human I deeply admire, I remember that she taught me that Black stories are Black stories. Maybe I'll just, yeah, she taught me that I'm welcome to read these stories and be uplifted by them, but they were not written for me. It's appropriate that I honor her by remembering that she taught us not to appropriate Black folks' experiences or feelings, even as we teach and learn about them. I honor her by practicing cultural humility towards Black folks. Deep bow. And then you have this next section, nod to Black feminists, activists, and abolitionists.
Yes, and in our traditions, right, in our South Asian traditions, whether we're Gujarati or Punjabi or Tamil, we are taught on a deep level to honor our teachers, right? And we also are taught that teachers don't always have a formal guru title, right? Teachers come in many forms. And so when I begin to think about kind of our people and how we value that learning, the co-learning, that's who came to mind when I asked myself the question, who taught me to love myself? And today is Malcolm X Day, it's the anniversary of his birthday. And he had asked some really provocative questions about who taught you to hate yourself? Who taught you to hate the skin you were born in? And that speech is like seared into my mind and my soul. And, the similar questions show up in Bell Hooks, similar questions show up in James Baldwin. And these are people who aren't like distant to us, right? So the people I'm in community with regularly speak of these people as if they were real people in our lives, like family members. So Baba, Charles, my life partner, and I often communicate in quotes that are really,
I love that.
Like today there was something that happened, and he basically wrote me Malcolm X's speech, and I wrote back to him about the rest of the speech. There was our son, practicing baseball, and here we are communicating with each other in Malcolm X's words. And so some of that needed to show up on these pages, right? Some of that honoring my mother by marriage and dedicating verses to her when she passed away, and honoring the Black grief that, this week I have noticed, again, my own words came to me this week when I noticed after the tragic shooting in Buffalo, not far from you all.
Yes.
You know, that the sacred grief of Black folks is just not honored by the media. It's not honored by us, everyday people, you know, workspaces, and not realizing how deeply interconnected Black folks are, and that this isn't an isolated incident. There are just so many ways that we need to process all of that. And as someone in relation with folks of color, of all races, right? So folks of color is just sort of a captured term, but really we can't claim to be folks of color unless we're actively doing the work of unlearning our anti-Blackness. And so throughout these pages, I sort of shed light on that in the context of my experiences. And that was also on purpose. You know, part of the critical part of me was like, well, why, you know, why make it about you? But really, why not? Because I think very often, as much as I want to write my trauma responses generally and vaguely, I think we need to situate them in incidents and specificities of time and place and relation. And so that's one of the things I did in the pages that you spoke of. And when Valerie Boyd passed away, I was again reminded of some of these pages. And if that's okay with you, I wanted to read to you.
Oh, yes, please.
The next part where I write about, you know, after I ask the questions with a blank page of who is my community.
Yes.
And how do I create belonging to community, and how did I learn to be in community? And really for me, it was Black folks. Definitely in Botswana, you know, that we had so much chosen family and people who, you know, who really did mean it when they said my brother, and just like showed up to my dad's funeral and were there as his siblings, because his own biological siblings were in India and did not attend his funeral, and also did not believe in burial, you know. And I talk about those complexities of someone who was born in the Hindu faith and whose family observes those rites of passing from this life. But my father had been a Baha'i for many years, and you know, wished to be buried in Africa, and that is what was important to him, and he wrote in his will. And so his relatives were not there, and yet his chosen family were. They came and they buried him, and they gave him the last rites and the Tswana style speeches that happened at his burial spot, where people gave the kinds of speeches I said, you know, like I can't make this up, you know, just one after the other, people would come up and talk about Rasiti and, you know, say things. And so those are some of the things I'm leaning on when I write this note, and I say, you know, Ntozake Shange passes away, and this was in October 2018, and my Black kin are grieving, right? So there's Black grief is sacred and it's ongoing and it seems relentless, and yet Black joy coexists. And I really wanted to complicate the story of Black trauma and Black grief, because in my personal experience, they coexist. And so what really struck me about Ntozake Shange in particular was, you know, because I live in the Atlanta area, she was very beloved here, just like Valerie, right? So many people just, when Valerie passed, it was people right here in my neighborhood. She lived not far from me, and I had never had the privilege and honor of meeting her in person. So some of this came to mind, and I said, I lost many people and I've suffered deep regret. In the time of coronavirus, I could not be with my chosen family who passed away. I write this for all the folks I did not thank enough while they were still with us. Beloved, did you know how much we loved you? As you fought to catch your breath and could not speak, could not even write, when you battled to hold on to life. Did you know how much we'd mourn your passing? Did we show you love while you were among the living? I suspect we did not. I suspect that you flew from this earthly plane, relying on the love you found within. And that is, it was a much longer piece. I'm like, I turned the page expecting to read the rest of it, but I edited it out. I was like, oh, no. Yes, I took that out. But there, you know, really, that was the piece I read when I saw everything that you and Anjali wrote about Valerie upon her passing recently.
I can't, I was going to say I can't believe she's gone, but actually, you know, by working with her and interviewing her, you know, and our conversations again made me remember that we're in community with our ancestors too. And so she's not gone, she's just joined. And you know, the whole idea of tracing literary lineage, which is what your book is doing. And I think it's so important, you know, and that something that she and I were both interested in is extending this idea of community. And I'm, you know, it's interesting what you're saying. I'm interested in this. So it's not co-opting Black grief, but also I was asked to, you know, nominate a couple of books for a list for AA, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, right? It's May, what we're in. And I said, you know, actually, I had a couple of Asian American texts, and then I said, I'd also like to include Valerie Boyd's book, right? Gathering Blossoms Under Fire, right? The edited journals of Alice Walker. And I said, you know, I know this isn't Asian American, but I think this is really important. And also the problem that I'm having with the Heritage Months at this moment is it's a silo, right? How do we have, I think I felt the same way. So that Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde were so important to me. And that's not to say that I'm Black, but that also, I mean, we're influenced by who we're influenced. They helped teach me how to speak. And I think as the daughter of immigrants who were afraid of speaking, you know, speaking up at work or speaking up against really all kinds of situations.
Yes.
It was really Black women writers and women of color more generally, but who I felt like I learned from them how to speak in difficult situations.
And there are layers of nuance, right? Just because we venerate them and thank them does not mean that we get to co-opt, right? So what I mention, you know, in these pages, even as I thank them, you know, I jot down in my journal entry that I note that even as they teach us and uplift us, you know, we often harm them. And we have to be cognizant of that, always cognizant of those boundaries to honor their grief, to honor their joy, to honor the sacredness and humanity of their complex being in the world, even as we thank them and remember that they are the reason why we write the way we write, think the way we think, and be the way we be. You know, and I want to also say that we do, you know, very often silo. I want to kind of hone in on that. And, you know, there are South Asian writers who, you know, will publicly, especially on Twitter, shame writers like you and me who are diasporic writers for not citing people from the mainland enough. And, you know, I feel the pain of that. I feel, you know, I feel what they're saying, and yet, you know,
I don't see that. I mean, maybe I've not been, I haven't seen that on Twitter. I guess I feel like that's so, I don't know, it just seems so ridiculous to me. I feel like the diaspora for me is where it's really interesting, but that's also because that's my experience. You know, I don't have a lived experience in India. I've never been there with my father, who's the one who grew up there.
Yes.
Been there with my mother, and I haven't been to Kenya, and so I have a picture of my grandmother behind me, and that photo was taken in Kenya, I believe. Yes.
I hope you get to visit. It is my life aspiration to return to East Africa as well.
It is my life aspiration to go there. So I'm glad we can, you know, to put that out there. I think, you know, I'm wearing these earrings, and I was over at my parents' house earlier this week, and my mom said, "Oh, are those are my earrings?" Because I often would wear her jewelry because that's the only thing I had from, you know, that she had as, you know, as a young person, that she had in Africa, that she had in Nairobi. And I said, no, actually, these, I lost those. I felt terrible about this, but somehow in all these moves. But when I went with my American-born Tamilian husband and his parents to India, to Chennai, they had a pair of, you know, I got to pick out the size, you know, from what I could remember. So in my high school senior picture, I'm wearing earrings that look just like this, and now I'm wearing them, and these happen to be from India. I mean, if I could choose, I would have the other ones, right, the original ones that were my mother's. But yeah, I'm always really interested in, you know, what objects we carry with us, you know, and what they mean. And I don't know if I'd feel the same way if, you know, I had been to my parents' homeland, but because I hadn't, I was looking for those artifacts and evidence.
Yes, artifacts matter, and as partly why I created the book the way I did is I wanted eventually for it to be an artifact that was personalized by the reader.
And you did that. It's amazing. I mean, I think
there were so many intentions I had for the book, because in my mind, you know, I'm like you, I'm very tangible. I need like things. And so, you know, and I have so few, having been relocated so many times. And also my ancestors were partitioned. And so I don't know, when I read the partition stories of there being an object that they carried, I don't think our family has such a thing.
Right.
You know, also my relatives don't want to talk about it.
Right, that trauma, right.
Yes. So I am that person after many generations. And it's so interesting about embodiment as well as sort of artifacts, because when I was studying and when I was a teenager, I used to study a lot, right? So that's why my sight is now failing, my vision.
Oh my God, that's why?
Well, you know, and I was always studious. It was a trauma response too, I think.
Yes, right.
I would read and I would just be like this, like a subconscious thing that I would do was, and my mother would say, stop that. That's how my mother, who has passed away when she was 1, used to do the same gesture. And my Didi, who also has passed away, she was in her late 30s when she passed away.
I'm so sorry.
And so apparently it was like my Nani, maternal grandmother, and then her daughter who passed away too soon, and then me. And so whenever I would do these gestures, it would totally trip my mom up. And she'd say, stop that. But I'm like, I can't help who I embody, right? Yeah. Like what you were saying moments ago about our ancestors being with us. And I wanted to convey some of those things in these pages by using certain code words that only Punjabi speakers and people who share cultures with me could find. I definitely learned from Dr. Morrison, you know, and it sort of did some deep study around white gaze and really didn't write to it as far as I know. But sometimes those things are so subconscious because we're such deeply colonized.
We're so steeped in it. I think it's.
Yeah, but my intent was very much to write as if I were speaking from the heart, like we are speaking to someone who shared identities with me, even if they weren't identical.
The voice is really, I mean, I feel like the voice is so strong and really comes through, and that's what I find myself responding to. I wanted to bring up this thing about academia, right? About if I could read a little bit from the book.
Yes, and we have to be mindful of time, says Dan.
Oh, wow. Oh my God, goodness. You know, well, maybe I won't do that then. I went so fast. Dan, you were right.
In the chat from our audience or those who've joined us. And again, thank you to those who joined us. And I know there are people who are going to listen to the recording afterwards, and I want to cross too. But if there aren't any questions, then maybe we could do your question.
You write, I am no longer drawn to college campuses. I no longer belong there. And just for almost 2 decades of my life, I considered college campuses home-like. I was lulled by their quirky charms and architecture. I was lured in by their fancy gardens and manicured landscapes. Me too. I was attracted to the energy of youth and curiosity. I was sucked into the majestic libraries. I know, right? I was consoled by predictable practices. I was willing to overlook the slights and dismissals. I had faith in my own studiousness. I later realized that I had so much of my worth and identity tied up in scholarship and being an educator. These identities stifled me. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, a little bit, and one of the things that I honor is that silence is a love language too, for someone as vocal as I am. There are some things that I abstain from going into great detail around because I am still healing those parts of me, because I don't want the unhealed parts of my academic trauma to bleed on folks who are pursuing academic lives and careers.
I love that you have the space. You have space in the book for silence and also for responding.
That was on purpose, right? And as far as academia, the unbelonging that I experienced almost 5 years ago now, where I walked into work one day and the dean informed me that I had already been locked out of the system and I had the end of day to leave. And that's when I started to collect all the objects. I'm a collector, so every little gift, like even if my students handed me at the end of class a little Post-it with a request to meet, I saved it.
Yeah, I know the office, yeah.
Some students would drop by for office hours and I might have been at a meeting and they would leave me a Post-it at the door and then I would save it. And I had to leave all of that, not to mention previous drafts of this. Files, things, whatever I could manage to scoop together into a few boxes that were provided for me, I did. And then the rest of them I left. So it was a very drastic kind of layoff, but really all of the 1,000 cuts that led to that is really what I'm still continuing to heal from. And I think this book is not possible unless I am doing that deep work, right? Mm-hmm. Right? If I were still beholden to, in some ways, and had my worth in academia, some of this work would not be possible. And so in many ways, I'm beginning to come to acceptance around that. And if coming to acceptance around unbelonging in academia and being able to state it in a matter-of-fact way is one sort of marker along the path that's very circuitous and sometimes feels like a maze to healing from academic trauma, then I'm kind of on that maze. And that's how I wish to answer your question, is that it's still ongoing,
I'll just say when I read that, I remembered that also for me when college campuses were really beautiful, and I realized this was before the pandemic, but that how exclusionary they are. I mean, I don't know how I missed that. I mean, that says more about me, I guess, but how buildings aren't well marked in terms of accessibility. Like there are codes. You have to already be part of the community to know where to go.
Yes.
And how, what that communicates. So thank you for writing this beautiful book that is open, that can be read in all these different ways. And I've had a hard time reading books straight through during the pandemic. And I love that I could open this book and have race is socially constructed, but materially real. Let us read up, unlearn. I mean, that I could open it up and have something interesting that was, I don't want to say bite-sized, but just something to think about, and then I could go back to it. So
yes, I think that's how our learners are responding. Towards the end of my time teaching, when I was creating syllabi, I was constantly looking for things like this because I noticed that the learners are so mentally and intellectually overstimulated that they weren't able to do deep thinking if they were inundated in heavy text.
Yeah.
And one of the things I had done long before I left academia was to sort of change up some of the ways in which we do assessments, some of the ways in which we assign readings, some of the way in which we design syllabi. I was already mixing that up. And you can't do that so blatantly before somebody says you're laid off. I was kind of unapologetic. And really, that's the word that a lot of people use to describe the book. And I'm like, yeah, I think so.
I love that. Very last question. What are you reading now, or what are you writing now?
So it has been such a exhausting spell. So like my brain can only do little bite-sized readings, and I read a lot for Desi Book Auntie work. And so I do read a lot of early copies and sort of advanced reader copies of KidLit in particular. And those are great because, especially middle grade, I can whiz through them in one afternoon. So I read a lot of those. But I've needed to pace myself because of my vision is really suffering. But I have been spending time, I want to say, with this one. And every time I read, it's like the same thing as you just described, is I could go to any page and then read an entry and then reflect on it and journal on it and write thoughts and responses. I am not currently working on a writing project.
Hallelujah. No.
And I may not write another book. And just the fact that this exists is in some ways miraculous. And I want to thank you for actually, and I think I'll get emotional here. I'm going to thank you for three things, because I must thank you in a timely manner. I want to thank you for writing your book, because until I saw it, I did not imagine that such a thing could actually be possible. And when I read your book, I was experiencing a lot of no's from agents. And so I went ahead and found a workaround, and I'm unagented, but found a small press by building community. We have talked about community. I must also thank you because one of the books that you had recommended.
Yeah.
And the thing is, Sejal, I respect you on so many deep levels. And this was one where I said, if Sejal is saying we should all read it, I'm going to read it.
Mia Birdsong's How We Show Up, right?
And it teaches us. And I teach Jamila's here, and she's shown up. And Jamila is one of my comrades' beloveds, right? It's such a sacred trust to be called her auntie. And is on the regular, I will give her a sermon that comes right out of here. Because we begin to embody it. And you're the reason why I found this book. So thank you. Thank you for being part of the generous literary community that I have always hoped for and rarely found. And you mean so much to me, Sejal. And this time together is a gesture. It's actually a tangible gesture of writing community that has been evasive for me. I've been very disheartened in the first few months since the book came out. And you have enheartened me. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Asante sana.
You are so welcome, Gayatri. I really appreciated being interviewed by you and Namrata in that collaborative way. And I don't think I'd ever done that. Like speaking of community, I was so exhausted when my own book was coming out, and to have a Google Doc where we could be in conversation, it was, I'm really happy that, and thank you to Writers and Books for creating these opportunities to have conversations like this. Thank you for your book. Thank you for your book.
Thank you both so much. That was such a great conversation. Gayatri, congratulations on the book.
Unbelonging.
Unbelonging. Buy it. The link is in the chat. Link to Sejal's book as well. I want to thank everyone for coming. You can see our upcoming events on our website, wab.org. And I want to say thank you and have a great night.
Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.